how do you as a young person set boundaries and decide what's good for you and what's good for other people? So how do you navigate that? How do you learn to respect other people as well as respect yourself? And I think that's so crucial for autistic young people. Masking has come out as a hugely influential factor in the experience of violence. They might be quite quiet in the classroom, quite subdued, doing what they're told, and then they come out of school and they either kind of explode in meltdown or completely shut down. Most autistic young people mask, most autistic people mask.
Hello and welcome to This is Autism, the podcast from the North East Autism Society. My name is Kerrie Highcock and I'm the Family Development Manager at the charity. Today I'm joined by Dr Amy Pearson, a late identified autistic researcher and assistant professor in psychology at Durham University. Amy has written a lot about the experiences of autistic adults, including personal relationships, victimization and masking. So thanks for coming on the podcast today, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerrie.
Lovely to have you here again. So Amy, just before we start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm an assistant professor at Durham University in psychology at the moment, and I'm based in the Centre for Neurodiversity and Development. So I started my career doing a PhD in autism research around 10 years ago now. And I primarily focused on cognitive development, so understanding how autistic children and adults see the world from different points of view. And once I finished my PhD, I started to move into much more experiential work. So I'm really interested in the everyday experiences of autistic people and how we can understand that in order to try and improve society for autistic people and improve access to things like education, healthcare, and ensure autistic people have good relationships and good mental health outcomes.
Wonderful. So it sounds like you do a lot of wonderful stuff. Well, I know that you do a lot of wonderful stuff. And I know that you've recently won an award in science for your research exploring abuse for autistic people at the hands of someone that they know. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was really lovely to win that. That was the Mary Ann Liebert Rosalind Franklin Award for Women in Science, and it was for a paper called "This is Just How This Friendship Worked." And it was exploring the experience of something called interpersonal victimization among autistic adults. So that tends to be abuse from people that autistic people know, so people like friends, family members, carers, but can also include things like teachers and colleagues. So we asked people about their experiences and we just gave them some really simple questions. We just said, have you ever been victimized by someone that you know? And would you like to tell us a bit about it? And have you ever been taken advantage of by someone that you know? And can you tell us a bit about it? And this is building off the back of some work we'd done with a really small group of autistic adults, asking about their experiences of victimization and mate crime. And compliance came out as a major issue in that. So autistic people feeling like they had to do what other people told them to in order to fit in order to make friends, and in order to stay safe. So we really wanted to explore that in more detail with a larger group of people. And what we found was that the autistic people that we interviewed reported having been victimized by multiple people that they knew across the lifespan. So it didn't tend to be a one-off occurrence. It was something that tended to happen again and again in various relationships. And that had led to significant difficulties with trusting other people and trusting their own judgment as well. So feeling like, they might meet someone and like them and then really not be sure of whether their judgment on that person was accurate because they'd had such bad experiences before. They also highlighted compliance, so feeling like they had to do what other people told them to. For some people, that was because they felt awkward or impolite when they tried to advocate for themselves and set boundaries. For other people, it was because they knew they had to do it in order to stay safe. So some of the people had experienced really harrowing and really serious events and had talked about knowing that they had to do what the other person told them to in order to try and stay as safe as possible in those situations. So the findings of the research was really bleak, but it helps us to try and unpack our understanding around some of the things that might be leading to autistic people having these increased experiences and get us to think about what we can do about it to try and help people.
And when you talked about compliance there, Amy, I think that's a very kind of powerful word, isn't it? Do you think that links to like earlier work for children, young people around, that lack of autonomy, maybe in education, and that, need to mask and not be yourself? Do you think kind of you can see a parallel from growing up into adulthood around compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we've seen in follow-up work. So we've followed this up with multiple studies, one with a really large number of autistic adults reflecting on their experiences across the lifespan, and then another looking specifically at intimate partner violence as a form of violence and abuse among autistic adults. And the people within those studies talked about how from such a young age in life, regardless of whether they knew they were autistic or not, having to comply with what other people wanted, feeling like they didn't have any bodily autonomy. So even things like not being able to choose when you go to the toilet at school, for our participants, it reinforced the idea that actually it wasn't them that got to make decisions about their own lives. And so that meant for them that when they entered relationships that were really quite unhealthy and people were telling them what to do, were being highly controlling, they thought that was just something that they had to go along with because they'd always been told you need to do what other people tell you to. And they also talked about always feeling like the way that they were was wrong, that they'd constantly been told that other people's interpretations of what was going on or what was happening to them was more correct than what they thought was happening to them. And so that meant that, again, when they started to experience abuse, it really prevented them from sticking up for themselves and from feeling like there was something wrong about that situation.
Yeah. And I think that then links into kind of invalidation my work predominantly, as you know, is more so with young kind of adolescents, and that kind of invalidation, particularly around maybe sensory experiences within, not just education, but across the kind of the whole world for that person of, if you're saying, actually, every time I sit in this room, I feel physically sick, and somebody's saying, don't be ridiculous, kind of get on with it, that kind of feeds that feeling of invalidation, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And that was one of those things that I think for a lot of people that might seem like such a minor situation, but actually when you're getting that constantly from so many different people, it does lead to this internal sensation that actually anything that you do and anything that you think about your own experience must be wrong, which really sets people up to experience a range of different abuses. Because if you think that everyone is more correct than you think that the way that those people treat you must be okay as well.
Absolutely. So I think you kind of touched on this, but why do you think this type of research is so important, Amy? What was your driving force behind this?
Yeah, so one of the things that really pushed me to do this is knowing that so statistically, research at the moment is suggesting that between 50 to 90% of autistic people have been victimized by someone that they know. So that's between half to almost all of autistic adults. And in our research, we found that for the majority of people, this started in childhood. So it would begin with peers and teachers, sometimes family members, and that carried on across the lifespan. And we think that this is obviously feeding into poor mental health outcomes for autistic people, higher levels of things like suicidality, just a range of really incredibly poor outcomes. And so understanding how autistic people make sense of those experiences, it also helps us to figure out where we need to target support, and also what we need to do in order to prevent it. So one of the things that we've seen is that it can't just be explained by one single feature of an autistic person. There are lots of really complicated things going on that increase risk. And what we need to do is we need to address all of those different things from different sides in order to try and not just support people who have experienced it, but try and prevent it from happening in the first place.
Absolutely. So would you, I know again, you're talking a lot about adults, Amy, but if you kind of had a magic wand, which I don't have, but if you're looking at kind of children, young people growing up, and talking about that kind of early support, what kind of things do you feel would be useful early on for an autistic child or neurodivergent child?
Yeah, so this is something we're really hoping to do some work on soon. But if I had a magic wand and I could wave it, obviously I would just prevent the abuse from happening in the first place. But I think what I would do is really make sure that we have good work early on in autistic children's lives on recognizing what we call red flags and green flags in relationships. So what are the signs of an unhealthy relationship? How do we assert autonomy over our own bodies? How do we understand consent? There are situations that I think a lot of people don't really understand, can have quite a negative impact on a young person. So, for instance, requesting a hug from a child, and if they don't want to, being like, no, go on, just give me one, pushing people to give physical contact when they don't want to, can really reinforce to a young person that actually they're not in control of their own body. So then if someone else touches them inappropriately and they think you have to just acquiesce to that to give in, that's obviously a major problem. But also talking about what good relationships look like. So, what are the signs of a healthy relationship? How do you as a young person set boundaries and decide what's good for you and what's good for other people? And I think really focusing on that as a mutual thing. So you can set your own boundaries, you can understand consent for yourself and assert your own autonomy, but other people are going to have different needs to you and they're going to have different boundaries. So how do you navigate that? How do you learn to respect other people as well as respect yourself? And I think that's so crucial for autistic young people. It's crucial for all young people, but for autistic young people who frequently get left out of things like relationship and sex education, we don't necessarily have tools that are currently aimed at autistic young people to really address some of the nuance around that, some of the complexity. I think there's a big kind of gap there that we really need to fill.
Yeah, and quite the opposite. We need quite the opposite, don't we, of traditional social skills training, which isn't helpful for many of our people. Also feeds into that narrative, doesn't it, of masking. So, okay, well, we're going to take a little break there, Amy, and then we will come back and we'll talk a little bit more about your research around autistic masking, if that's okay. Hi, while we're on a quick break, I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about the Family Development Service here at the North East Autism Society. The Family Development Services provides support for families pre, during and after diagnosis and includes a variety of services including our parent and toddler groups, autism hubs, workshops for families, a dedicated enquiry line and our resource site as well, which can be found at the family resource site on the North East Autism Society website. So if you go to ne-as.org.uk and go along to the family development site, you can find all the information there. Welcome back to This is Autism. We're here with Dr Amy Pearson talking about her wonderful research. So Amy, just to jump straight back in on what we were talking about, a big question here for you, but is it society that frames autistic people as more vulnerable in relationships, or is this actually a thing?
Well, that's a really great question. The answer is that it's really complicated. So effectively, a lot of previous research has said that autistic people might experience things like bullying, like victimization, because we're not great at recognizing social signals, and that makes us inherently more vulnerable than other people. And that puts all of the onus and all of the blame really onto the autistic person for having those experiences. It says, you aren't very good at spotting social manipulation, and this is why these bad things happen to you. And I think it's important to recognize that we can all be more vulnerable, like all humans, not just autistic people, at different parts of the lifespan, depending on things like our circumstances. So children are more vulnerable because they're physically smaller and less able to defend themselves. Likewise, we might think that older adults are more vulnerable because they tend to be a little bit more physically frail. We experience vulnerability through things like losing a job, becoming homeless, things that kind of push us outside to the margins of society a little bit. So mean that we have less access to support, we have fewer resources, and those things tend to result in being more vulnerable. But what we've seen is that for autistic people, there does seem to be a combination of a variety of different things that feed into increased vulnerability. So one of those is difficulty recognizing kind of manipulative behavior or ingenuine behavior. And this is something that autistic people have talked about themselves. But alongside that, we see lots of other things that feed in from childhood. So things like invalidation, like we were saying before, and difficulty in asserting agency, feeling like you don't have very much choice or control. The way in which people talk about autistic people really sets us up to feel like violence against us is okay, because we talk about autistic people in really negative ways. We talk about autistic people as impaired, as deficient, as lacking empathy, as not understanding. And that leads to autistic people being viewed as less human. And we also start to see ourselves as less human. So when people start treating us in ways that isn't very nice, we think, well, that's how people like that are treated. This is how people like me are treated. This seems quite normal. And that obviously feeds into some serious issues with recognizing abuse for what it is. So there are lots and lots of really complicated factors that construct that experience of vulnerability. It isn't just difficulty with social signals. And the problem there is that pulling those things apart is really hard, right? Because if you have always experienced being told that you misinterpret social situations, when you're an adult, can you tell whether you really are or not? Like, is it that you're bad at recognizing social signals, or is it that you think you're bad at it and therefore you don't trust yourself? It's really hard to disentangle. So yeah, it's a little bit of both, I think, there. But it means that there are lots of areas that we need to target. So we need to help individual people. We need to look at things like peer and family relationships and make sure that those are really strong and healthy. We need to make sure that schools, support systems have a really good understanding of autistic people and work in really validating ways. We need to make sure, again, that places like, the workplace, our overall understanding of autism in society shifts, the way that the media talks about autistic people changes. Then all of that feeds into improving the situation for autistic people and reducing vulnerability and reducing violence.
The way you said that at the end sounded really simple, but how complex, Amy, is all of that?
I know. Yeah, it's not an easy task.
But you're just the person to try it, definitely. So I think, well, I do know the answer to this question, but just for our listeners, does this research link with your research around masking?
It does, yeah. So masking has come out as a hugely influential factor in the experience of violence. And we find that it both leads to the experience of violence and occurs as a response to the experience of violence. So the people that we've spoken to have talked about, again, from childhood, experiencing peer victimization, experiencing bullying, and feeling like they need to change how they appear to other people in order to stay safe. But then that also leads to further compliance and something we call fawning. So the idea that you have to try and really emphasize how much you agree with the other person, right? And how great they are and how much you like them in order for you to feel like they're going to treat you well. And that then feeds into higher risk of victimization, because if you seem like you comply easily, if you seem like the kind of person who can be pushed over, then other people will take advantage and manipulate. And so it causes a bit of a vicious cycle where people are starting to mask to stay safe. And actually that's leading to a lack of safety. And then they're continuing to try and gain that little bit of safety back. And it's a really awful situation. So again, that early work, thinking about what we can do to help autistic young people stay safe, build healthy relationships, and to be able to express authenticity when it's safe for them to do so, is something that we think might work in a protective manner with relation to the experience of victimization and vulnerability.
So, Amy, what would you say are some of the main signs, outward signs, maybe? Because I know some of these are incredibly subtle and internalized. But for parent carers listening in, what would be some kind of very potentially obvious signs that a young person is masking?
So, I think two of the major things that are often signs for parents, teachers, people who are with the young person quite a lot, is the discrepancy between how they are in different situations, and also engaging in particular coping strategies. So one of the things that people tend to report seeing with young people in particular is the difference between how they act at school and how they act at home. So it might be that at school, they seem to be coping quite well. They might be quite quiet in the classroom, quite subdued, doing what they're told. And then they come out of school and they either kind of explode in meltdown or completely shut down and can't really engage with the family. And those two things together, so that difference between the environments and then also the engaging in the meltdown or the shutdown, tend to be quite important indicators that a child's engaging in masking, because they're having to suppress so much at school and engage in so much conscious control of their own behaviour and how they're perceived by other people, that when they immediately get out of that environment and into a safer environment, so they're around their family, then that's when they can kind of like either relax fully or just kind of tighten right back up and go inside themselves. So I think that can be really helpful for recognising that. But also seeing a difference in quite subtle things. So if we take something like stimming, for instance, you know, when people are at home, they might stim in much larger ways than they will in other environments. So subtle ways, hands in pockets when they're at school, kind of really pulling themselves in to be a smaller version of themselves. And then when they're at home, engaging, you know, much more comfortable or bigger movements, it being obvious when they're regulating themselves. Again, those things can be quite subtle indicators, but they can be quite important to look out for if you think that your child is masking. And I think the thing to say there is that when we say if your child is masking, it's likely that your child is masking. Most autistic young people mask, most autistic people mask. It might look more obvious in some people, but a lot of the time it doesn't really matter whether, you know, a person uses language to communicate or not, whether they have high support needs or low support needs. Masking is something that autistic people engage in because it's a way to stay safe, particularly in environments which might be really overstimulating.
Yeah, and I think that's the first part to understanding, isn't it? The recognition that masking exists is because I obviously do a lot of work where I see children in school and then in home, so I completely get the two pictures. And it's a very, very real thing. There's no question about it. But I think we need to, I mean, you do work around this on a much more complex level, Amy, but I think just that very simple message that masking exists and this is a thing, particularly for educators and other professionals, is really, really important, that parents, carers aren't being dramatic.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that actually is quite important to emphasise, is that I think we have this idea of masking as something that, you know, kids who have a lot of conscious understanding of themselves engage in. And that isn't necessarily the case. So we see masking emerge as a response to things like invalidation, being in really sensorily overwhelming environments. And sometimes that isn't something that that person thinks about, but it's more of a sense of, that didn't go well, that situation was bad, and I'm going to have to do something to try and keep me safer or to make that go less bad next time. And so I think often teachers maybe have this expectation that, you know, it's children who are more obviously autistic in one environment and less obviously autistic in another environment. And it doesn't necessarily capture how complicated masking really is. But I think there's a lot more work to do there in order to help people recognise when masking might be occurring, in order to talk to young people about, you know, what makes them feel safe, where they feel safe, and that sort of thing. There's a lot for us to do.
Absolutely. Which leads us into your wonderful book. So I have been reading your wonderful book with the lovely Kieran Rose, and it's just wonderful, lovely. Just, well, it's a really difficult topic. Actually, it's not wonderfully lovely in that sense, but it's just written in a wonderfully lovely way. If that works. So tell us a little bit about it, Amy.
Thank you. Yeah, I must say that is quite funny. So the book's been really well received, but we did have one negative Amazon review, and it said that the book was a bit dreary, and I was like, well, it's not on a very pleasant topic, so I don't think it's going to be particularly cheerful. It's a bit of a bleak book. But yeah, so what we really wanted to do was give a bit of a touchstone. So at this point in time, what is our understanding of masking? What is masking? And what are the kinds of things that underpin it? So How does it relate to things like identity and how our identity changes based on the situation we're in? How does it relate to things like gender and other intersectional aspects of our identity? So things like our race or ethnicity, or whether we have co-occurring diagnoses, things like learning disabilities as well as autism. And so we go over all of those things. And we also talk about the current state of our understanding from the academic literature. So what has research shown us so far about masking? What's missing from the discussions? And what do we think we really need to focus on in future? And so towards the end of the book, we talk about things like how we can help autistic people express authenticity in a way that's safe, because it isn't always safe for people to do that. And to try and introduce a bit of a different way of thinking about masking. So not just thinking of masking as hiding bits of yourself, but also sometimes projecting bits of yourself. So Kieran calls this projecting acceptability. And it's the idea that sometimes people mask by playing up features of themselves. So these might be kids who are the class clown, for instance, because people think they've got a diagnosis of autism or ADHD that's going to make them naughty. And so they're treated as if they're going to be a problem. And so they become the problem because that's what people expect of them. It's almost safer to be the problem than it is to try and stay well behaved and then potentially not know how people are going to respond to you. It's all about instilling certainty within your own situation. A bad response is still a predictable response. And so it makes people feel that little bit safer. And that's the bit of masking that I think people often don't really think about, the idea that it doesn't always result in you being quiet and well-behaved and unseen. It might result in you being quite visible, but that visibility is very predictable for you.
That's very interesting. And I did read about that in the book. And I think that's a completely different way of thinking about masking, Amy, which I imagine a lot of the people listening to this may not have thought about before. So, yeah, interesting. So, Amy, where can people find the book if they want to get a copy?
Yeah, so the book is available on the Pavilion website, who is the publisher, or it's also available through Amazon, which is usually the easiest place, I think, for most people to find it. You can also find it on Kieran's website. He's got lots of links there to our book and various other books as well, which might be of interest to some of your listeners.
Wonderful. So, Amy, before we end, what's the next steps for you? What are you working on at the moment?
That's a great question. At the moment, we're trying to extend the work we're doing around healthy relationships. So we just recently released a healthy relationships resource aimed at autistic adults. That is available on the Durham University Centre for Neurodiversity and Development website. It's a free resource and we have two versions. So one is pitched at autistic adults and adolescents. So we have kind of piloted this with teenagers and they tend to understand that. So it seems to be accessible for younger people as well. Talks about red flags, green flags and amber flags in relationships. So sometimes a relationship might be bad, but that doesn't mean that it's abusive. So what do we do when we're in a relationship that is unhealthy, but maybe not for abusive reasons? And we don't have to put up with that either. But we also have a version that we developed in conjunction with Sunderland People First. And that is a version that is easy read with photo symbols. It's aimed at autistic people with learning disabilities in order to support them in recognising healthy relationships too. And so what we're aiming to do next is to extend this work. So we're going to hopefully, I'm pulling a grant together at the moment to try and get some funding to do some further work with autistic and other neurodivergent young people about healthy relationships, understanding what those look like, what we can do to support them, and also thinking about how we turn what we've done with our adults into training to help organisations understand how to support autistic people who've experienced forms of violence.
Wonderful. And I have seen that resource and it's wonderful, Amy. So fantastic. I am sure you've also got 100 other things you're doing alongside that, but that's probably the main thing in your mind at the minute.
You know me very well.
So I think thank you so much, Amy, for joining us today, and to all our listeners, thank you so much. If you've got any questions or comments about anything you've heard, please get in touch at info@ne-as.org.uk. You can also follow the North East Autism Society on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or LinkedIn. The podcast This is Autism comes out each month, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google or Spotify so you never miss an episode. So bye for now.